The fog came down so thick at dawn that morning that men later swore it had weight that it pressed again. Their lungs muffled their prayers and hid death until it was already breathing down their necks. September 19th, 1944. Near the quiet French town of Arracourt. For weeks, General George S. Patton's Third Army had been racing east across France, a blur of dust, engine noise, and relentless ambition. The German army was reeling, battered from Normandy, and driven back by speed they hadn't believed possible. Maps were redrawn daily. Objectives changed hourly. Fuel ran short. Tempers flared. But Patton's tanks kept rolling until the fog came. Inside an M4 Sherman tank, crouched behind a hedgerow, Lieutenant Jack Red Callahan wiped condensation from the periscope with a gloved thumb and saw nothing but gray. No horizon, no enemy, no friendly lines, just a blank world that felt wrong, too quiet, too still. "Feels like we're sitting in God's blind spot," muttered Corporal Eddie Alvarez from the gunner's seat. Callahan didn't answer. He was listening to the engines idle, to the distant thump of artillery somewhere beyond the fog, to his own heartbeat. He'd been in combat long enough to know this feeling. When the air went dead like this, something terrible was about to move. What none of them knew, not Callahan, not Alvarez, not even Patton himself, was that through this fog, an entire German armored counteroffensive was rolling straight toward them. Panthers, Panzer 4s. Nearly 200 German tanks, fresh from reserve, ordered to smash the American advance in Lorraine and restore a collapsing front. And the men in the Shermans, outgunned, thinly supplied, and scattered, were about to meet them head-on. A dangerous pause. Arracourt wasn't supposed to be a battlefield. The Third Army had overextended itself. Patton's relentless push had outrun supply lines, especially fuel. By mid-September, tank units that should have been charging toward the German border were instead parked in muddy fields, engines off, conserving gasoline like liquid gold. To the Germans, this pause looked like weakness. General Hasso von Manteuffel, commander of the German 5th Panzer Army, saw opportunity in the fog. His intelligence reported American units spread thin, overconfident, and unprepared for a major armored strike. He gathered what strength he could, Panther battalions, veteran crews, and fresh replacements, and planned a decisive blow. The objective was simple: crush Patton's spearhead, destroy his tank divisions, and force the Americans back. The battlefield would be Arracourt. Inside the Sherman, the M4 Sherman had a reputation by 1944, and not a flattering one. Its armor was thinner than the German Panthers. Its main gun struggled at long range against heavier German tanks. American crews knew this. They joked darkly about being Ronson-lighters, hit once, light every time. But the Sherman had something else: reliability, speed, and crews trained to fight together, not alone. Callahan trusted his tank. He trusted his crew more. Driver, Private Sam Wilkes, sat hunched forward, hands light on the controls. He was barely 20, farm-raised, and could coax a tank through mud like it was a tractor back home. Loader Frank Dutch van Buren checked the ammunition rack for the third time, fingers brushing cold steel shells. He whispered to himself in Dutch where he was nervous. Alvarez waited behind the gun sight, jaw tight, eyes burning for something, anything to shoot at. They had no idea what was coming through the fog. First contact, it started as a vibration. Low, rhythmic, felt more than heard. Callahan froze. "Engine noise," he said quietly. "Not ours." The fog ahead shifted, thick as wool. Then a shape emerged, angular, sloped, armor unmistakable. "Panther," Alvarez breathed. The German tank appeared suddenly, barely 50 yards away, its long 75mm gun already slewing toward them. "Fire!" Callahan shouted. The Sherman roared. The gun bucked. The shell slammed into the Panther's side at close range, detonating with a violent crack. Flames burst from the German tank's engine deck. The Panther stopped dead. For a half-second, the world was silent again. Then the fog erupted. More shapes loomed out of the grey. Another Panther. Then another. Engines howled. German guns flashed. Shells screamed overhead. One slamming into the dirt so close it showered the Sherman with mud and stones. Back. Back. Callahan yelled. Wilkes threw the tank into reverse, tracks grinding as the Sherman lurched backward into cover. A German shell tore through the space they'd just occupied. The Battle for Arracourt had begun. Chaos in the mist across the rolling farmland. Similar scenes were unfolding. American tank platoons stumbled into German columns by accident, sometimes at point-blank range. In the fog, long-range German firepower meant nothing. It became a knife fight. Shermans darted forward, fired, reversed, relocated. Tank destroyers waited in ambush. Artillery observers called down fire on engine noise they couldn't even see. German crews, trained for deliberate, long-range engagements, found themselves blind and confused. Orders broke down. Radio traffic jammed with overlapping commands and shouted warnings. A Panther commander fired at a shadow that turned out to be another German tank. An American Sherman crested a rise and nearly collided head-on with a Panzer. For both crews firing simultaneously, shells crossing paths in the fog. Men screamed. Steel burned. Engines died. The battlefield became a series of isolated duels, decided in seconds. Patton's calm miles away at 3rd Army headquarters, reports began flooding in. Enemy armor, heavy contact, fog conditions, staff officers tensed. Someone suggested pulling back. Patton didn't flinch. Good, he said after reading the first summary. They're attacking us. He understood instantly what the Germans had done and why it would fail. They had committed armor into restricted visibility against American units trained in combined arms warfare with superior radios, artillery coordination, and air power waiting just above the clouds. Tell our boys to hold, Patton ordered, and kill every bastard tank they see. Learning to win by mid-morning, American commanders adjusted. They stopped trying to maneuver in large formations. Instead, they let the Germans come. Shermans hid behind hedgerows and folds in the land. Tank destroyers waited hull down. Infantry with bazookas crept forward through orchards and ditches. When a German tank appeared, it was hit from the side, or the rear, or by artillery falling from the unseen sky. Callahan's crew destroyed 2 more tanks before noon. One Panther took 3 hits before erupting in flame. The crew bailed out, silhouettes flickering in firelight before machine gun fire cut them down. Alvarez's hands shook after that one. Don't think about it, Callahan told him quietly. Just keep firing. The day turns red by afternoon. The fog began to lift. What it revealed was staggering. Burning German tanks littered the fields around Arracourt, black smoke rising like funeral pyres. American losses were real. Shermans knocked out, crews dead or wounded, but nowhere near what German planners had expected. Instead of smashing Patton's army, the Germans were being bled white. And this was only the first day. As the sun dipped low and the smoke hung heavy over the battlefield, Callahan climbed out of his tank for the first time since dawn. His ears rang. His uniform was streaked with oil and soot. He looked across the field and counted wreck after wreck after wreck. Jesus, Wilkes whispered beside him. How many do you think? Callahan didn't answer. Somewhere in the distance, engines were still moving. The Germans weren't done yet, and neither were Patton's Shermans. The morning fog did not lift so much as it thinned, like a wounded animal refusing to die. By the time the sun climbed higher over Lorraine, visibility at Arracourt stretched to a few hundred yards, enough to see wreckage, not enough to understand it. Burned-out German tanks lay twisted across the fields, their once feared silhouettes reduced to blackened carcasses. Some still smoldered. Others hissed softly as metal cooled and rainwater seeped into cracks. Lieutenant Jack Callahan stood atop his Sherman, binoculars pressed to his eyes, scanning a low ridgeline to the east. Somewhere beyond it, he knew, More German armor was regrouping. They always regrouped. "What do you think they're doing now?" Wilkes asked from below. Callahan lowered the glasses. "Learning," he said. "That's what scares me." The German realization General von Manteuffel's headquarters was in chaos. Reports from the front were contradictory and grim. Tank battalions that should have punched through American lines instead vanished. Radio operators listened to frantic transmissions dissolve into static. Panther crews reported being hit from directions they couldn't see by enemies they never spotted. This wasn't how German armor was supposed to fight. The Panther was designed for dominance, long-range gunnery, thick frontal armor, disciplined formation. But Arracourt had turned doctrine into a liability. The fog, the rolling terrain, and the American willingness to fight close had robbed the Germans of their advantages. Still, Manteufel refused to abandon the attack. He committed more armor. Orders went out. Push harder, faster, overwhelm them by sheer mass. Nearly 200 German tanks would now converge on a battlefield already choked with wreckage. Patton's counterstroke. Patton sensed it before the intelligence confirmed it. "They're doubling down," he said, pacing in front of a wall map dotted with grease pencil marks. "That means they're desperate." He called in air support, even though the weather still threatened to ground it. He repositioned artillery. He ordered his armored divisions not to advance but to wait. It went against every instinct he had. But it was right. Let the Germans attack again. Let them bleed again. Close range hell. The second German assault came just after noon. This time, the fog broke in patches, revealing sudden vistas of open ground and sudden exposure. German tanks surged forward in columns, engines roaring, guns firing as soon as American positions appeared. Callahan's platoon lay hidden behind a gentle rise. "Hold," he whispered over the radio. "Hold." The first Panther crested the ridge, then another, then 5 more. Fire. The hillside erupted. Shermans burst from concealment like predators. Guns flashing at point-blank range. Shells slammed into German flanks and rear armor. A Panzer IV exploded so violently its turret lifted clean off, tumbling through the air before crashing upside down. German return fire was savage but chaotic. One Sherman took a direct hit and vanished in a blossom of flame. The shockwave knocked Callahan to the turret floor. Alvarez screamed something, Callahan never knew what, and fired again. The battlefield dissolved into smoke, fire, and screaming steel. Adaptation hour by hour, the Americans refined their killing rhythm. They stopped chasing tanks and let tanks chase them. Tank destroyers waited behind ridges. Artillery observers rode with forward units, calling fire within minutes. Infantry pinned German crews as they bailed out, cutting down veterans who had survived years of war only to die in French fields. German losses mounted at a horrifying pace. By dusk, entire companies had been erased, and still they came. On the third morning, the sky finally cleared. It was as if the battlefield exhaled. Sunlight cut through lingering smoke, illuminating a landscape that looked less like farmland and more like a scrapyard for giants. Blackened hulks dotted the terrain in every direction. Tracks lay tangled like dead snakes. Ammunition cooked off sporadically, sharp cracks echoing across the fields. And above it all, engines. American fighters screamed out of the blue sky. Death from above. P-47 Thunderbolts dove low, their wings bristling with rockets and machine guns. Pilots spotted German armor moving along roads and in tree lines, exposed at last. The attacks were merciless. Rockets slammed into engine decks. Strafing runs stitched fire across turret roofs. German crews abandoned tanks mid-motion, scattering for cover that didn't exist. From his tank, Callahan watched a Panther take a direct rocket hit, erupting into a fireball so bright it hurt to look at. Air Force finally showed up. Alvarez said, awe creeping into his voice. "Yeah," Callahan replied. "And they're angry they missed the fun." German collapse, German command cohesion shattered. Without air cover, without clear lines of communication and facing relentless ground pressure, the Panzer attack lost all momentum. Units fought independently, desperately, often suicidally. Some crews charged American lines in hopeless frontal assaults. Others tried to retreat, only to be cut down by airstrikes or artillery. By evening, the scale of the disaster was undeniable. Over 100 German tanks destroyed. And the battle wasn't over. The cost victory didn't feel clean. Callahan helped pull bodies from a burned-out Sherman, hand shaking as he worked. The smell of burnt flesh clung to his clothes. He couldn't eat, couldn't sleep. Wilkes stared silently at the horizon, eyes hollow. "Think this ends the war?" he asked quietly. Callahan shook his head. "No," he said, "but it ends something." The Germans tried one last time. It came at dawn, again, as if clinging to habit might save them. A final armored thrust pushed toward American positions, fewer tanks now, crews exhausted, fuel low. But they were still dangerous, still deadly. The Americans met them with calm precision. Shermans fired, reversed, repositioned. Artillery thundered. Fighters prowled overhead. By mid-morning it was clear. The German offensive had failed completely. By the way, if you're gripping this moment with me, watching history tilt on a knife's edge, make sure to hit subscribe. There's more just ahead, and the end of this battle changed everything. And then the guns kept firing. Aftermath in steel. When silence finally settled over Arracourt, it felt unreal. American crews emerged slowly from their tanks, blinking in the sunlight. They walked among the wreckage in stunned disbelief. German tanks lay everywhere, countless. By the final tally, nearly 200 German Panzers had been destroyed or abandoned. Patton's Shermans, outgunned on paper, had annihilated one of Germany's last armored counteroffensives in the West. Patton's quiet victory. Patton toured the battlefield days later. He said little. He didn't need to. The wrecks spoke for him. Arracourt was more than a victory, it was proof. Proof that doctrine could be broken. That technology alone didn't win wars. That leadership, coordination, and grit could turn supposed weakness into decisive strength. For the men who fought there, it was simpler. They had survived, and they had stopped the Panzers. Silence fell first as a weight, then as a hollow ache. The morning after the last German assault, the fields around Arracourt were eerily quiet. Smoke still coiled from burning tanks, forming dark spirals that climbed and dissolved into the pale September sky. Blackened metal glimmered in the weak sunlight. Tracks of both German and American tanks crisscrossed the terrain, intersecting like the veins of some wounded creature. Lieutenant Callahan surveyed the landscape from the top of his Sherman. He could see the scale of destruction, and for the first time, he truly felt it, the enormity of what they had survived and what they had done. 200 German tanks, every one a testament to engineering, training, and the deadly arrogance of the enemy. And yet, here they lay, inert, smoking, defeated. Private Wilkes emerged from the driver's hatch, his uniform smeared with oil and soot. I can't believe we actually did it," he said, voice trembling. 200, how many of them are left? Callahan shook his head. Barely a handful. They underestimated the fog. They underestimated us. Alvarez stood nearby, inspecting his gun. "We killed their best crews. They'll be talking about this, if any of them live to tell it." He swallowed hard. Some of them probably didn't. Dutch Van Buren, ever pragmatic, lit a cigarette and stared at the wreckage. "It doesn't feel like a victory when you see it up close," he muttered. Bodies, metal, fire, death everywhere. Callahan didn't answer. There was nothing to say. The battlefield had a memory of its own, a brutal ledger of what had been spent and what had survived. German withdrawal Manteuffel was at his headquarters, staring at maps the color of despair. His counter-offensive had been annihilated. Entire Panther companies had been destroyed. Fuel shortages prevented a retreat by organized units. Chaos reigned. Yet somehow the Germans pulled back. What remained of their armored forces melted into the forests and secondary roads, leaving the Americans in full control of Arracourt. The withdrawal was messy, desperate, and humiliating. Crews abandoned their tanks, leaving engines still running, ammunition stored within hulls baked in the sun until it erupted spontaneously, producing small secondary explosions. Soldiers walked through mud and debris, some surrendering, others captured after attempting escape under fire from American patrols. For the survivors, Arracourt became a symbol of the futility of fighting against an American force that could coordinate artillery, air support, and armored tactics with deadly precision, even in conditions that should have favored the attacker. The toll on the American losses, though smaller than the German catastrophe, were significant. Shermans disabled, destroyed, or burned totaled dozens. Crew casualties were high, some killed outright, others wounded and left in the mud as medical teams scrambled. Callahan's own platoon had lost a tank, and the shell-shocked survivors carried scars that would not fade. Yet morale soared despite the cost. The men knew they had achieved something remarkable, a textbook case of defensive armored tactics, executed under chaos and confusion against a superior number of technologically heavier opponents. The significance wasn't lost on Patton either. Reports filtered back to 3rd Army headquarters with stark clarity. The German armored counterattack had failed. Entire divisions of elite Panzers had been neutralized. The momentum of the 3rd Army would not be halted. Stories from the field. Callahan wandered the battlefield, moving from tank to tank, taking mental notes. He listened to the survivors recount their experiences. Sergeant Hayes described facing 3 Panthers at once and using hedgerows for cover, engaging in a deadly dance of positioning and fire. "We didn't shoot straight," Hayes said quietly. "We shot smart, that's all." Private Lewis recounted knocking out a Panzer IV with a flanking maneuver. See its crew bail and sprint into the field only to be picked off by friendly fire. "It's ugly," he said. "Ugly and fast." Corporal Alvarez's story centered on improvisation. Ammunition was low, coordination faltering, but careful observation and patience turned the tables. "Every shell we fired counted," he said. "Every decision had to be perfect. Every tale was different, but one thread tied them all together. The Americans had fought as one organism, reacting and adapting faster than the German doctrine allowed. The fog lifts. By evening, the fog had fully dissipated, revealing the carnage beneath. The battlefield was a grim mosaic: burned-out tanks, shattered earth, abandoned supplies, and scattered personal belongings. Smoke from lingering fires painted the sky with streaks of gray and orange. The sharp smell of oil, metal, and cordite filled the air. Men stumbled across it all, walking carefully to avoid shrapnel, burned tires, and debris. Callahan knelt by a destroyed Panther and surveyed the wreckage. The crew had clearly tried to repair their gun, but the Sherman's shell had torn through its armor like paper. "These guys fought well," he whispered, more to himself than anyone else. Too bad it wasn't enough. Lessons etched in steel. Arracourt was a demonstration of principle. Numbers alone do not win battles. Heavy armor is meaningless without coordination, tactics, and adaptability. The Shermans, though lightly armored compared to German tanks, leveraged speed, communication, and human ingenuity to devastate the enemy. This day would be studied for years in armored divisions across the world. Lessons learned would influence training, tactics, and doctrine for decades, but for the men on the ground it was simply survival. A brutal, bloody test they had passed by wit, will, and courage. Morning sun illuminated a battlefield scarred beyond recognition. Smoke rose from hundreds of twisted tanks, their turrets ripped off, hatches scorched, and tracks bent into grotesque angles. The earth was churned into mud and craters, still smoldering from the previous day's bombardments. Patton's men had begun the grim task of clearing the battlefield. Crews salvaged what they could: weapons, radio sets, machine guns, and ammunition. Tanks that could be repaired were towed or dragged back to maintenance depots. The rest were left as monuments to victory and proof of the German failure. Recognition and reflection orders came down from 3rd Army headquarters for formal recognition of heroism. Callahan's crew received commendations, though they remained uncomfortable with the fanfare. "We did what we had to do," Callahan said. "We were just part of a bigger machine." Yet in private moments, each man carried the weight of the battle. Alvarez replayed the moments when his shots had hit German crews, imagining their lives hanging in the balance. Wilkes quietly mourned his friends who had not survived the day. Dutch Van Buren had nightmares of burning tanks and twisted metal. The battlefield refused to let him sleep. Even Patton, always larger than life, noted quietly in his log, "The actions at Arracourt show that the measure of an army lies not in the hardware alone, but in the resolve of men willing to act decisively in chaos." The strategic shift, the destruction of German R at Arracourt, forced a strategic realignment. The German 5th Panzer Army had lost its offensive capability in Lorraine. Subsequent operations were defensive, retreating behind secondary lines. The momentum in the West firmly favored the Allies. Patton's 3rd Army continued its drive toward the Saar and the Rhine, now unimpeded by massed German armored attacks. Commanders across the Allied front noted the significance. Light tanks, when combined with effective coordination, artillery support, and adaptive tactics, could decisively defeat numerically superior opponents. Arracourt became a case study in armored warfare. Personal toll for Callahan and his crew. Survival was coupled with survivors' guilt. They had killed hundreds. They had destroyed a German offensive. And yet, they questioned the morality of what had happened. "I don't know if we're heroes," Alvarez said one evening, staring at the blackened horizon. "I just know we're alive." Callahan placed a hand on his shoulder. "We did what we had to do," he said softly. "History will sort the rest." The weight of their actions pressed on them, but they found solace in each other, in the shared experience of surviving something extraordinary. Weeks later, as the 3rd Army pressed deeper into Germany, the stories of Arracourt spread quietly among the ranks. Not the headlines of newspapers, but the whispered tales among armored units, how a handful of Sherman, under Patton's direction and guided by skilled crews, had destroyed a formidable German armored force. Military historians would later look at the numbers. 200 German Panzers destroyed or disabled, dozens of Shermans lost, casualty ratios favoring the Americans, but those numbers could not capture the human courage, the split-second decisions, the improvisation under fire that had won the day. Enduring lessons. Arracourt was not just a battle, it was a turning point. It proved that doctrine, no matter how rigid, could be broken by adaptability, that superior numbers and armor could be overcome by tactical innovation, that leadership, Patton's decisiveness, and his crew's courage mattered as much as any piece of steel. For Lieutenant Callahan, the battlefield left a permanent mark. He would carry the scars, both physical and emotional, for the rest of his life. He would tell his grandchildren about the fog, the heat, the smoke, and the moment when a Sherman's shell changed the course of an entire engagement. For the German survivors, Arracourt became a symbol of miscalculation, a bitter lesson in the limits of technical superiority without tactical flexibility. Closing scene. Callahan stood once more among the ruins, watching smoke curl into the sky, sunlight glinting off twisted metal. He raised his binoculars one last time, scanning the horizon for movement that would never come. He saw nothing but silence. A wind blew across the battlefield, carrying with it the faint scent of oil, cordite, and burnt earth. Somewhere in the distance, a bird cried. A Sherman's engine idled faintly, ready to move, ready to fight again, but the day was done. And in that quiet, Lieutenant Callahan understood the truth of Arracourt, that courage, coordination, and determination could transform ordinary men and ordinary tanks into an unstoppable force, that even against overwhelming odds, the impossible could be made real. History would remember the numbers. Those who survived would remember the faces, the smells, the fire, and the sound of steel ripping steel. And for Patton's Shermans at Arracourt, that day would forever be immortal, a testament to human ingenuity, bravery, and the unforgiving art of war.